Hello, folks. The Comics Kid 2099 here. A little while back, I had a comment on a video that I did requesting that I show my X-Men collection and a possible X-Men reading order. I did a video like this when I first started doing videos, but that's been about 7 years, I think, and a lot's changed. I've gotten a lot more books since I did that video. So I wanted to go ahead and do an update as per request, and I'm probably not going to talk about each book in depth. I'm just going to kind of go over and kind of talk about different eras of X-Men books a little bit and hopefully you guys can see. I know with these big essential books you can kind of tell the title, but once these books start getting smaller, I'll kind of zoom in a little bit and let you see them. But here we have these 3 books here. That encompasses everything in the Silver Age. This book right here, Essential Uncanny X-Men, I talked about this a little bit in some of my Examining the X-Men videos, but they did a reprint of that called Essential Classic X-Men Volume 1. Let's move pie chart here. And so if you find Essential Classic X-Men out in the wild, it's exactly the same thing as Essential Uncanny X-Men. And you'll see my Volume 2 and Volume 3 are Essential Classic X-Men, but that jumps right into this. There's nothing missing if you happen to get Uncanny and then get Classic Volume 2. But that is everything before Giant Size X-Men Volume or Issue 1, where you even get the Beast, his solo adventures in Amazing Adventures. That is collected here in Volume 3. You get a few assorted team-up adventures. There's a couple of Spider-Man stories in there where the X-Men kind of guest star. And then we get into the all-new, all-different X-Men here with Essential X-Men Volume 1. That starts with Len Wein and Dave Cockrum on Giant Size X-Men Issue 1, and then it goes into, I believe, X-Men Issue 94, which is when Chris Claremont jumps on the book and stays on that title for 16 years. And so all these Essential X-Men books are going to be written by Chris Claremont starting here. And then speaking of Claremont, we have Captain Britain. I'll go ahead and pull this out. These 2 trade paperbacks I have here, I've read this one. If you're curious why some of these are turned vertically, or they're not vertically, rather, they're turned the wrong way, basically, it's because I haven't read them. And I've got a whole bunch more X-Men books that I have not read. Let's look over here. See, there's a whole bunch here that I have not yet read. All of these are just over here to the side until I can read them. And then I've got even more downstairs. So you've got the last 2 volumes of Essential X-Men. I am so glad that they finished off Claremont's run on Essential X-Men before they stopped reprinting or putting out the Essential volumes. So glad. There's some volumes of Essential Wolverine. I think I'm only missing 1 or 2 of those volumes. Got some Dazzler here, some of the Peter David X Factor. So I've got stuff here that I have not read, but some of the books that I have not read, like this one here, Captain Britain Volume 2, are filed away in the spot that they're supposed to go on the shelf. And I want to go ahead and say that the comment that asked me to do this was saying that they'd like to see a recommended reading order. And I would say don't worry about starting at the very beginning with 1963, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I would say don't worry about starting there. I would recommend find some characters that you really like, and then find some stories featuring those characters and see what you enjoy. If you like Wolverine, go ahead and dabble in like the Chris Claremont, Frank Miller Wolverine miniseries, or Old Man Logan, or the Enemy of the State storyline, which is here by John Romita Jr. and Mark Millar. Do that and see what you enjoy. And then if you don't like that character, move on to another character. Because starting at the very beginning, you're going to get yourself burned out very quickly on stories that are not very good. Everything before Essential X-Men Volume 1, everything before Giant Size Issue 1, most of that is subpar. There are a few issues here and there that are pretty good, but compared to a lot of the other stuff from the Silver Age, compared to Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Captain America, the Avengers, compared to all of that, X-Men is not a very good series. Now, it's about as good as Daredevil, which also wasn't very good until Frank Miller came along, but it's not one of the better Silver Age books from the 60s. So I would recommend start somewhere else other than the very beginning. There are numerous different places you can get into. I've had this conversation before with Ian on Geeky Gentleman, where he said that X-Men is one of the most difficult to penetrate series, and I don't entirely understand that comment because we just had a movie called Avengers Endgame, which is one of the highest grossing films of all time, and it's also very heavy on continuity of the past 10 years worth of movies, 20-something films, very heavy on continuity, and people love that movie. I think if you can watch Avengers Endgame and you can understand what's going on, you can probably pick up just about any X-Men comic and you can understand what's going on. There are going to be exceptions. We've had 50-something years of X-Men comics, so obviously some of them are not going to be very good. Some of them are not going to be very new reader friendly. But I think most of them you can pick up and you can pretty quickly pick up on what's going on. Getting back to what's going on here, haven't read this, but Chris Claremont was also writing Captain Britain while he was first starting on X-Men, and that pretty quickly became, I guess, less important than the Team X-Men book, because here is right when the Dark Phoenix saga started, and that is when people started paying attention to the X-Men. Obviously, you've probably heard the story that X-Men was not selling well, so they decided to turn it into a reprint series, so starting with issue 67 of the original X-Men series, it started reprinting older issues, and then starting with issue 94, they went back to new stories. And for a little while, it was like, this is okay, better than what it was when they went to a reprint title, but people weren't really lavishing praise on it like they do now. Retrospectively, people will say that this run is phenomenal, and it really started with the Dark Phoenix saga. That's when people started saying this is one of the best series of all time. And then around that time, I guess, Claremont started focusing more of his effort onto the X-Men because he was also writing books like Miss Marvel. He wrote that for a little bit. Spider-Woman, he wrote that for a little bit, all around this time. Because as far as he knew, this X-Men thing was just going to tank like it did before, and then he had a couple back doors that he could go out of. He could continue writing Captain Britain or Spider-Woman or Miss Marvel if he so chose. But then those books all kind of stopped. They weren't as popular as X-Men ended up being. But then Captain Britain returned under the hands of Alan Moore and Alan Davis. We have this book here, which it's been a long time since I've read it, but I remember really enjoying it. And then I'm going to skip over here a little bit. We have this one where Alan Davis continued on art duties, and then Jamie Delano, he wrote a little bit of Captain Britain, and you may have heard Jamie Delano's name in reference to Hellblazer at DC Comics, John Constantine. He had a little bit of a run there, and I believe he's written some other stuff, but that's the big thing that I know from him. But then, like I said, we got this Wolverine book. Not my favorite. A lot of people point to that as one of the best Wolverine stories. I don't think it's that good, but I'm not here to review every book on this shelf. So then, moving on, we got New Mutants. This was really where X-Men stopped being a series and started being a franchise with multiple books involved. And you could say, well, wouldn't that have started with Captain Britain? Sure, I guess, but Captain Britain started off as just another corner of the Marvel Universe. It wasn't an X-Men book at first. It was a good little ways on down the line before Betsy Braddock was introduced into the X-Men book. She had already been introduced in the Captain Britain series, but then she was shown to be a mutant and a member of the X-Men after the around the time of the Mutant Massacre, which is like way over here probably. And so at that time, Captain Britain kind of was retroactively an X-Men series. So now, if they were to do a Captain Britain series right this instant, it would kind of be considered part of the X-Men family. But at this time, all of this here, it was not. But with New Mutants, this spun right out of the events of the X-Men series where Professor Xavier believes the X-Men are dead. The New Mutants are formed, and then they start fighting some of the characters that the X-Men are fighting around this time. The Brood, Madam Hydra, pretty much for the first couple volumes of New Mutants, anything that the X-Men fight, the New Mutants end up tangling with that a little bit as well. The Shadow King, he shows up in that series. It does eventually develop an identity of its own, and now Marvel is doing these epic collections where they are, in theory, collecting every series and every issue of every series. So eventually, they're probably going to go back and collect some of these early New Mutants things. I think maybe they've already done one that collects the early stuff, but I already had these classics volumes, and maybe some of them were Visionaries volumes. I don't think so. But I already had like the first 7 classic volumes, which is all that they did. And then they did an epic collection, which I have here, Curse of the Valkyrie. Valkyries, that actually has some stuff that I did not have. But if you are interested in reading the New Mutant stuff, you might be better off just getting those Epic collections, which are a little bigger. They're going to be a little bit more expensive than the cover price is on these books, but I know a couple of these are really hard to find on eBay. So if you do want to read that series, you might be better off just getting those Epic books. The thing I don't like about those is that they jump around a lot. They did this Curse of the Valkyries thing, which is like volume 9 or something, volume 6, and then I don't think they've done volumes 2 through 5. So that's my complaint there. Also, you have Alpha Flight, which these characters had shown up in X-Men, but then they got their own book, and it pretty quickly became its own thing. These 3 volumes, written and drawn and inked by John Byrne, they are not really an X-Men book. Even though these characters technically first appeared in the X-Men, this was its own thing. It was not a part of the X-Men family. And if you can find the John Byrne stuff, I highly recommend it. It's very good. I've seen more than a few people talk about this as kind of an underground, very well-written surprise hit. I don't want to say a surprise, because John Byrne, regardless of how he acts as a person, is a very good comic book creator. But a lot of people talk about this as a influence on Game of Thrones, especially whichever issue it is that has, okay, so this issue here where it's like somebody in Alpha Flight is going to die, and then someone actually dies, which is kind of a big deal in the 80s. I mean, yeah, we already had the Dark Phoenix saga, but this was not something that was done that often. And so this is something that a lot of people, I've seen more than one person say that George R.R. Martin was probably influenced by that. We know that he read Marvel Comics in the 60s. I don't know if he was reading Alpha Flight. I'm not going to make that statement. But we got Magic and Storm Illyana. This is it's a thing. It's kind of fills in some of Illyana's backstory when she was in Limbo. Then we've got Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. This is, you honestly probably don't have to read that. That's not one that I really liked. I did a review on that a long time ago, and if I reread it, maybe I would feel differently about it, but I remember really not liking that story. And then we've got a couple others here. Iceman, pretty forgettable. Trying to flesh out Iceman as a character, because up until now, he had just been part of a team, whether it was Silver Age X-Men or the Defenders or the Champions, and this was trying to make him be his own thing. It didn't really work, because after this, I think his next solo series was in the early 2000s. And then we have Longshot. This is another example of just another part of the Marvel Universe and not necessarily an X-Men title at the time. And then Chris Claremont has a habit of grabbing characters who someone else may have introduced them somewhere, and if they're not being used, then he would bring them into the X-Men world. He did that with Jessica Drew, who is Spider-Woman. He did that with Miss Marvel. Those were characters that he had written. He did that with Mystique, Sabretooth, Deathbird. These are all characters who were introduced in other titles and then became known as X-Men characters. Same thing with Longshot. Longshot just shows up at one point in the X-Men books and he's part of the team, but at first he had his own series, and it was just like if Doctor Strange had his own series. It was just, part of the Marvel Universe. Continuing with Claremont's run, we have X-Men Vignettes here, which long story short, in the 1980s, there was a series called Classic X-Men, or X-Men Classic. It changed its name at one point, and it was reprinting stuff from early in John Byrne and Chris Claremont's run. And then they also had these backup stories that Claremont was writing that would kind of flesh out some of these characters. Really solid stuff here with X-Men Vignettes. There's a couple of volumes. For all I know, Marvel may have reprinted some of that more recently, but these volumes are very good. Just small character stuff. Not a lot of big superhero fights in those. Then we have New Mutants here. I have not read this volume. Then we have Fallen Angels, which is a miniseries that is actually very good. It's a kind of a character piece. It's kind of a spin-off of the New Mutants, really. It's got a couple of characters from New Mutants and then some other characters who would later on be more closely associated with the X-Men, like Boom Boom and Multiple Man. They're in that, and they feature. And then we have X-Men versus Avengers, which is not the one you're thinking of. This is about right around the time of the trial of Magneto, and it's fun, but you don't have to read it. If you read X-Men issue 200, which features the trial of Magneto, this is not something that is crucial to read when you're reading that. Follow the Mutants, one of the first big events with the X-Men. It's not, air quotes, a crossover, because there's stuff happening in X-Men and X-Factor, which that was going on right around here. X-Factor first started here, and I don't actually have I haven't read any of those Essential X Factor books. I've started on one, I think, but they're downstairs. I have like all 5 volumes of Essential X Factor. But anyway, Follow the Mutants, you had different stuff going on in New Mutants, X-Men, and X Factor, but there was small connections between all 3, but it was not a crossover event. This was just kind of a thematic crossover, if you will, not so much a full-on crossover with stuff leading from one series into another. This is just some of the annuals at the time. I think it's not an actual story. Yeah, there's some story in there, like the New Mutants and Shadow King that was going on in this, but this is that pretty famous X-Men cover you've probably seen. Then Excalibur starts around here. I've heard people say they don't like the early Excalibur stuff, and I'm very surprised by that because I think it's one of my favorite of this era. Around this time, X-Men was not as good as it had once been. It's still Claremont, so it's better than what it could have been, I guess, but I like, you know, consistently, I think Claremont did a pretty good job overall, but there are parts of his 16 years on the book that are not as good as some of the other parts. But Excalibur, I think he got a breath of fresh air here where he was able to do the same crossover-y type stuff, the same weird science fiction and fantasy stuff he was doing in X-Men, but do it with more of a comedic bent. If you have ever read the 1980s Justice League International stuff, Excalibur kind of feels like that, but not quite as goofy. There is more comedy here, but it's also not nearly as side-splitting as that Justice League International stuff. And then we got some Marvel Comics Presents stuff, which was just kind of a tryout period for Wolverine to get his own series, but Marvel Comics Presents, at any given time, there would be like 4 different stories going on, like a Black Panther story or a Quicksilver solo story, and then Wolverine would have a little 10-part arc or something. This is before the Barry Windsor Smith reveal that kind of showed his origin, which I want to say that happened just right after Claremont left. But then over here, you can barely see those. You have Inferno, which really is the first actual crossover. Still, you don't have like the New Mutants are not full-on meeting up with the X-Men in that, but there's a demonic invasion of New York City. The New Mutants are dealing with it. X-Factor and X-Men are actually teaming up, and you've got stuff leading from one book into another, so that really is the first actual X-Men crossover. Not a good story. I do not like X-Men Inferno. It's not entirely the fault of the people making the comics. A lot of it was editorial mandating certain stuff that would happen, but it's still not a good story. And then Wolverine Legends, I believe this is the Havoc Wolverine Meltdown. Yeah, a pretty solid, underrated story. I may have just messed up. Let me see if I can get that in there one-handed. It's a pretty underrated story. I don't think a lot of people really know about it, but it's Wolverine and Havoc going on a road trip and then dealing with a Cold War mutant. Pretty solid, very good, well, if you don't like that that artwork that was on the cover, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to rewind the video and look at it. If you don't like that artwork, you may not like the book because the art is very non-standard, but I like the story quite a bit. Moving on down here, this is getting really close to the end. You can see a scroll mask here that I got from my time when I was on the Marvel message boards as a moderator, signed by Joe Quesada, if you care about that. But we're getting close to when Claremont was getting ready to leave. There's actually 2 more of these, Volume 10 and Volume 11, which I showed you earlier, but this is getting close to the end. I think for a good long period here, X-Men was coming out twice a month, so this is like 1990 or so, and I think he left in 91. But anyway, we got more Excalibur, we got a Wolverine Nick Fury team-up, Excalibur, X-Force. I've done a review on this, and then, so it's weird what they're doing with X-Force. You have an X-Force omnibus, and then you have the Executioner Song, which was one of the first post-Claremont crossovers, I believe. Might have been the first post-Claremont crossover, which around this time, Excalibur still was going on, but Claremont left the book, and then Alan Davis, who had been doing the art, he continues with his own run. It lasted a little while, and like I said, they're doing epic collections, collecting some of this. They have done some of that with Excalibur. If you get these classic volumes and then the Alan Davis Visionaries, you're going to be skipping about 6 issues, I think. But I have the other volumes of the Alan Davis stuff, and I just haven't read them yet. You also have Peter David's first run on X-Factor, collected in these 4 very minor, very small books. These things are super tiny. I think they've done a epic collection collecting all of that, plus maybe a little bit more, like a crossover with his Hulk run that was going on at the time. But then you have Executioner Song, which kind of, this has like 2 or 3 issues of X-Force. Then Deadpool and X-Force. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm not a huge fan of Deadpool. The reason I got this book is because this collects a huge swath of X-Force comics. So you go from this omnibus to Executioner's Song to this Deadpool and X-Force omnibus, and then there is another omnibus coming out called Cable and X-Force, which is going to collect the next batch of X-Force issues, and I haven't ordered that yet because it's like $100. I got this one for $60 or $50, so I'm not going to pay $100 for an omnibus about this size, but I will get that one eventually. I'm hoping they'll just keep doing the X-Force stuff in Omnibuy, like go all the way up to when Mike Allred and Peter Milligan did their X-Force run. That would be really cool, because that is a big chunk of X-Men stuff that I don't have. But then around this time, like I said, Chris Claremont leaves the book. Basically, he felt like editorial was treating the artist, who at the time was Jim Lee, treating the artist better than they were treating him. And they were, because at that time, Todd McFarlane did a Spider-Man comic that sold like a bazillion copies. And so they figured, well, the artist is more important than the writer. And so they basically told him, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And so he left and then didn't come back to the X-Men until probably very late 90s, very early 2000s. So then we have Fatal Attractions. I've done a review on that recently. Skinning of Souls. This is where things kind of jump around, because Marvel has not consistently collected a lot of the stuff in the 90s. You have huge chunks of it that have been collected. I can't tell you how many times Age of Apocalypse has been collected. There were these super tiny little golden embossed covered Age of Apocalypse trades, and then you had these, the epic collections of the Age of Apocalypse. Then they did an omnibus. They did recently, they did these that I thought were very confusing, where it was like Age of Apocalypse Reign, Age of Apocalypse Alpha and Omega, and I don't know what order to read those in. What I like about these is that there's numbers, and you can tell what order they go in. But anyway, so much stuff going on here. By now, New Mutants has ended. Excalibur is still going on. New Mutants basically becomes X-Force. We get a new teenage X-Men team called Generation X. There are a couple of these. There's the Origin here, which collects the Phalanx Covenant, another kind of crossover where the Phalanx are attacking, and then in Excalibur, it's kind of doing its own thing. In X-Men, it's kind of doing its own thing. That launches Generation X. The first 25 issues of Generation X are solid. Very, very solid. After that, it's kind of hit or miss. I haven't read a lot of what comes later, but it's not as good as those first 25 or so issues. But then you have Age of Apocalypse. You've got a lot of miniseries around this time. Cable as a little kid or a teenager here, and then you had like Cyclops and Phoenix in the future. Rogue gets her own miniseries. Storm gets her own miniseries. A whole lot of that going on around this time. And a lot of that, like, I've read this Rogue miniseries. I could not tell you what happens in it. I'm sorry. I don't even remember who wrote or drew it. This one, I think, is a Bishop miniseries. It is. Again, I don't remember what's happening in there. I think just about every X-Men character has had a miniseries kind of showing what they were doing when they weren't with the X-Men, and a lot of times I think they could have just not done that. But like I was saying, the X-Men, there's not a whole lot of, like, you know, if you wanted to read everything from 1963 all the way to 1991, you pretty much could do that. After that, it gets a little spotty, and maybe with these epic collections, they're going to do a better job of just consistently collecting a string of issues instead of collecting, you know, here's a few issues here in this story, and then we'll skip a few issues to do the next one. But we've got Onslaught around this time. I actually have all of these epic collections of Onslaught. I've only read the first volume, though. But what I've read, I really enjoyed, and I was kind of surprised by that, because I haven't heard a lot of good things about the Onslaught saga. X-Men, The Trial of Gambit, I've done a review of that. Operation Zero Tolerance, I've done a review of that. We have, this is Wolverine Not Dead Yet, done a review of that. I'm going to try and skip over talking about stuff that I've done videos on, so if you want to see those videos, you can just look at my videos. But I got a couple of these. They're calling it like X-Men Gold Volume 0, because around the time that these two books came out, you had Cullen Bunn, and I cannot remember who was doing art with him, doing X-Men Blue, which was the time-displaced original 5 X-Men, and then Mark Guggenheim doing X-Men Gold. These have nothing to do with those series. They just did these to try and synergy, I guess. I don't know. But this is that period where right after Operation Zero Tolerance, the X-Men are kind of persona non grata. Professor Xavier has been captured by the government. I have not read these because they're, you know, facing this way, but I'm really excited to read them because this is an era of X-Men that I didn't know a whole lot about. Got Magneto. This is when he gets control of the island nation of Genosha. Punisher Wolverine miniseries that was not very good. You've got Children of the Atom, written by Joe Casey, and I believe drawn by Steve Rude. Very, very good artwork. Steve Rude is an incredible artist. That's kind of an, air quotes, updated take on the X-Men's early years. You will see a lot of that if you're looking to get into the X-Men. People realize that that is a gold mine to tell stories because the original actual early years of the X-Men were not very good. So they think, well, we can make it better. We can actually do something with the characters instead of them just being boring white bread, which is what they were. You know, I've got hot takes all over the place. So that's probably one of the first examples of someone trying to do an updated take on the early years of the X-Men. Then you've got the Hidden Years, which I did a video on that. That is basically John Byrne saying, what if the X-Men did not become a reprint series starting with issue 67? And this is his take, pretending like the series kept going and then he was going to fill in the blanks in between 66 and Giant Size. It didn't last very long, so his goal did not work. I did a video on that, so you can kind of watch that video. Then you got a couple of little events here. This is just right before I started reading X-Men, but basically these books are a way to kind of end the monotony of the 1990s and kind of clear the field so that we can kind of have a fresh start for the X-Men. Around this time, a lot of books at Marvel were kind of just doing this fresh start, kind of light on continuity, giving people a chance to get into these books. With the X-Men, you had Grant Morrison doing New X-Men, which was the big get, but you also had Joe Casey for a little bit on Uncanny X-Men. Chris Claremont had returned. He had actually already returned in Uncanny X-Men, and then he moves over to Extreme X-Men. Then X-Force becomes an entirely different thing with not Peter David, that would have been very different. I cannot speak today. Peter Milligan and Mike Allred, they did a couple volumes of X-Force here, and then that became X-Statix. I am missing, I think, one volume of X-Statix, but that series, I think I heard, is actually coming back. So good time to get into this if you want to find out about the tone of that series. It's a very weird mix of goofy and also very serious. So very interesting series. I like it quite a bit. A lot of people who are huge fans of this X-Force do not like this X-Force, and that's fine. I think it's okay for this to be its own thing. This ran for over 100 issues before these guys came in, so that's a pretty good run, and you can't get too mad because all these characters eventually came back and they became X-Men characters again. But anyway, I started reading X-Men comics somewhere around this era. That was when I first started reading new X-Men comics right off the shelf. My very first not back issue X-Men comic was one of Joe Casey's X-Men issues. It's the one, spoiler, the one where Banshee gets his throat slit by Mystique. So this is right around the point where I was keeping up with the X-Men. Then you've got Exiles, which is another kind of, let's try and give a fresh start to the X-Men. This is basically Exiles meets Sliders, if you remember that sci-fi series with what's-his-face from Kangaroo Jack. Really good series. I liked Exiles quite a bit. There was a period where Chuck Austen was writing it, and I still really enjoyed it. And Chuck Austen is known as not a very good writer. He was still really good on Exiles. So, Origin, this is famously Wolverine's origin finally revealed before what happened with the Weapon X story. Then you get more Extreme X-Men. Here we come down. Oh, man. Getting old, guys. More X-Force from Peter Milligan and Mike Allred. Then we have more Exiles. Then you got Elektra and Wolverine. This is Greg Rucka. This is a illustrated prose story. This is not a full-on comic. So if you're one of those people like me, you prefer to have pictures in your stories, be careful if you decide to buy that book. Here's where I'm kind of just gonna, tell you, hey, here's a book. We got lots of Extreme, Exiles, X-Statix, New X-Men. We're finishing off Morrison's run of New X-Men in these big volumes. You can get an omnibus of Morrison's run that collects all of it, or you can get it in these 3 volumes like I have. Or you can get, I think 6 trade paperbacks that are about half the size of these volumes. But I like these volumes because Volume 1, which is up there, and then Volume 3, which is somewhere here, they collect the Morrison Manifesto, which was Grant Morrison writing out 5 pages single-spaced of what he wanted to accomplish with the X-Men. And in a way, it's very interesting. It's also interesting looking at how pop culture was so incredibly different in the year 2000. which is, I think, when he wrote that, very different than how things are in the year 2019. But a lot of what he said was very interesting, if very blunt. But I really enjoy reading behind-the-scenes stuff like that, process stuff. So then you got Chuck Austin's Uncanny X-Men run. If you've heard people say that this is the worst X-Men run ever, it's definitely in the top 5. I think you could read this volume and you would not be disappointed. This has a couple of good issues in it. It does get pretty bad after that, but I don't think it's the absolute worst. I think that Peter Milligan's X-Men run, which was coming right after Grant Morrison's new X-Men, that was probably the worst, in my humble opinion. So then we got more extreme Weapon X, written by Frank Thierry, who not a great writer, but I have a soft spot for this Weapon X series. And just recently, like in the last year, they did an omnibus collecting this whole series. I wish they had just continued collecting it in trades, because I have the first 2 volumes here, the draft, and I think I don't remember what the other one was, but it should be here somewhere, and I don't have it, but they did those, and then they didn't do any more trades, and there was still about half the series left that they didn't collect. Now it's all been collected, as well as X-Men Days of Future Now, which I did do a video on. That is single-handedly the most incomprehensible X-Men story you will ever read. When I said earlier that if you can watch Avengers Endgame, you can read X-Men, X-Men Days of Future Now would be the exception to that. It is hot garbage. Do not ever read that, and that is by Frank Thierry. It was kind of a wrap up to the Weapon X series. So we got more extreme here, Exiles, Austin's run. This is a Hulk Wolverine thing that, you know, there was a Hulk Wolverine and then there was a Wolverine Hulk, and I have this one. I don't have the Wolverine Hulk, but every time I see the cover of Wolverine Hulk like online, and it's kind of hard to find, it looks like the same artwork, so I don't even really remember the plot of this one. I hate to say it, but it's been a long time since I read it. But they did another one that was also teaming up those characters, so that makes it a little confusing for me. This is it, X-Men, or Weapon X The Underground. But then you got, let's see, I have 1 volume here of Greg Rucka. I believe this is Greg Rucka. Yep, Greg Rucka. You can, well, I can see it. This is the beginning of his solo Wolverine run. I've only read that volume. I thought it was okay. I don't really like Wolverine as a solo character. I probably talked about this before, but I think he works much better in a team. So that might seem surprising since I have so many of his stories, but I'm an X-Men completionist, so what can I say? Or a aspiring X-Men completionist, I guess I should say. So then we finish off Austin's run. Exiles continues. See, that's volume 5 of Exiles. It continues for like 14 volumes, and then there was another couple of volumes, I think 4 volumes, where Chris Claremont took over Exiles, and it was called New Exiles, and I have a few of those that you probably saw up on the shelf that I haven't read. And then there was another Exiles miniseries that I do not have, and then just recently the Exiles started again, and I haven't read that either. But then we get, let's see, NYX. This is the, I believe, the first official appearance of X-23 in the comics. She appeared in X-Men Evolution, then she appeared in this series, which is kind of a sort of an adult reader series. It's technically, it's not a Max book, which is like Marvel's version of Vertigo, I guess, but this is definitely for slightly more mature readers. But then eventually she shows up in Claremont's Uncanny X-Men run, which happened after his Extreme X-Men series ended. He went back to Uncanny, and that's where he brings X-23 into the X-Men books. So then, let's see, Extreme, it ends, and then we kind of have another shakeup of the creative teams where Joss Whedon's John Cassaday's Astonishing X-Men kind of becomes the flagship X-Men book. Claremont goes on to Uncanny. Then New X-Men Academy X, that is a series. There was actually somewhere over here a New Mutants book that I don't, here it is, Back to School. This creative team, Nunzio DeFlippis and Christina Weir, creative... they both, I don't know who was drawing, but they were both writing, and they were husband-wife duo. I really love this series. This was when I started with this one with issue 1, really loved it, and for the longest time, they only had this volume of this New Mutant series. Now, it lasted like 14-something issues, and then kind of abruptly the series ends, and it becomes New X-Men Academy X, still written by Weir and DeFlippis, and then they lasted for about 16 or so issues on New X-Men Academy X, and then they were replaced by Chris Yost and Craig Kyle. I did not like their run on New X-Men nearly as much as I liked the previous run. Now, I think they've done a epic collection collecting all of the New Mutant series that preceded New X-Men. So if you have this and you're a little disappointed that there's not more of this, there is now. I just haven't gotten around to ordering that yet. But then it eventually gets taken over by Craig and Yost, and I guess Kyle and Yost, whatever. I guess the good thing about when they took over, it became much more action heavy, but that was not what I was interested in. I was much more interested in the characters, and I felt like if you wanted to see explosions and punching, you could read literally any other X-Men book, but that's neither here nor there. So then we've got, let's see, like I said, X-Statix here, several more, team up and solo stuff, Rogue in a series that you really don't need to read. It's not that great. I'm sorry, for whoever worked on it, I did not care for that Rogue ongoing. Whedon's Astonishing X-Men run with John Cassaday. I've done videos on that. Then you've got basically this era of X-Men, there's a few gems here and there, but a lot of people didn't really like this era. And then House of M comes along and says, in Grant Morrison's run, we find out there's millions of mutants all over the planet. House of M says, no, screw that. There's like 300-something mutants on the planet now. And I did not like what House of M did for the X-Men. This is where things really started, in my opinion, not being as good, because this is where the X-Men start saying, we are going to protect ourselves first and foremost, and then the rest of the world can take care of themselves. Even though for the previous 40 years of X-Men comics, their motto was feared and hated by a world we are sworn to protect. And then at this point, this is where you start seeing Cyclops do some pretty crappy stuff to try and protect the mutant species or restart the mutant species. A lot of that will come, even down here, but that's kind of where it all gets its start in House of M, where the mutant species is decimated. And, I don't really like that, but now it's kind of seems like they're kind of backpedaling a little bit on it, where Cyclops is back and Wolverine's back to life and they're working together. And I haven't even read a lot of the most recent stuff, but I'm glad they're finally getting away from that. We had about 10 years of that, and that was a lot more than what I would have wanted. But this is also where Peter David's more well-known X-Factor series starts. I have read maybe half of that series. The problem is I've got several volumes up there that I haven't read, which you saw earlier, but the problem is that the last 4 or 5 volumes of his run are insanely out of print. You will see them on eBay for 50-something bucks. So I have not finished reading Peter David's X-Factor run, and it did get worse as it kept going. I think Peter David kind of ran out of steam on it, but then he kept writing. So that series starts off pretty good and kind of ends not nearly, or at least when I stopped reading, it wasn't as good as when it started. But then we've got Deadly Genesis here, which leads into Ed Brubaker's temporary run on Uncanny X-Men. Then you've got, more Exiles, more X-Statix. I'm just going to kind of burn through the rest of this here. There's that Ultimate Guide. I had one that I read to tatters, the cover was falling off. This is an updated version that I still like it, but now these things are so pointless. You can just go to Wikipedia and look up anything that these would tell you. But I did really love that when I was first getting in the X-Men. It was a really good guide to help me get into this world. So then we've got Peter Milligan's run on Adjectiveless X-Men is ending here. Peter Milligan's run, really not good, but gun to your head, if you have to read one volume of his run, I would recommend Blood of Apocalypse, which is still not great, but it's better than anything else that he did in that run. And then we get into kind of the what I like to say is kind of a second rebranding of the X-Men books with Rise and Fall of the Shi'ar Empire. That's, let me move this monstrous Spider-Man here. Alfie, if you're watching, Alfie from Geeky Gentleman, this is that monster spider thing that I was telling you about. He's probably not watching, that's okay. You got Rise and Fall of the Shi'ar Empire, which kind of a Game of Thrones in space, I guess, where a lot of different stuff going on with the Shi'ar Empire. I've done a video on this. I've done a video on this. Really like Mike Carey's X-Men run. It wasn't as good when Professor Xavier was the main character, but I still really like that. I'm going to have to hurry because I've got 13 minutes left on this before it runs out of film space. So I'm just going to kind of, there we go. Endangered Species. I remember whenever I had a subscription to Adjectiveless X-Men in the mail, and then when this started, I was buying all the other books that Endangered Species was happening in, which was like a backup story in X-Factor, Uncanny X-Men, and New X-Men, I think. And for whatever reason, in my mail subscription, they decided to not send me one of the issues that Endangered Species happened in, and I had to wait like 3 months before I finally said, hey guys, I don't think that issue is ever coming. So then they said, oh, sorry, we'll go ahead and get that to you. By the time they did, Messiah Complex was almost over. So I ended up actually reading almost all of Messiah Complex in single issues, like all at once, because they took forever to send me an issue that they should have sent me in the mail. So Endangered Species, not something you have to read. It's air quotes lead up to Messiah Complex, but it really doesn't have anything to do with Messiah Complex. I'm not a fan of Messiah Complex. I've done a video on that. This is around the point where Exiles ends, and then Chris Claremont takes over that. And then you've got somewhere here, you've got X-Men Die by the Sword, which is a horrendously awful crossover between New Excalibur and Exiles, which is just unreadable if you haven't been reading either of those books. I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere in this area. And here it is. It was right in front of me. Yeah, don't read this book. Unless you're just like a Claremont enthusiast and you really think that he can do no wrong, then you can read that, I guess. This is where, after New X-Men Academy X ended, which it ended during the events of Messiah Complex, you have X-Force, which is by Kyle and Yost, and this series started off, I did not enjoy it. I don't like it when a creative team or a writer or artist or whoever decides we're going to introduce some subplots in a series, and then when that series ends, we're going to take those subplots over to another series. I didn't like that. I felt like I was missing out because I hadn't finished reading their New X-Men series. I waited about a year on their New X-Men series before I finally just gave up and said, I'm done. Now, it turns out that's around the point where the series actually started to get better. I have since gone back and reread their New X-Men stuff, and I still don't think that it's great. But what I didn't like was this was carrying over subplots from that series, and I don't like it when any writer does that, even a writer that I really like Grant Morrison, say, for example. But then this is where Ed Brubaker's run kind of slowly casually transitions into Matt Fraction's run, because there for a little bit they were acting like they were going to alternate on arcs, and then Brubaker just kind of stopped doing that, and then it became the Fraction run, which I don't really like. The Fraction run, it's kind of forgettable in my opinion. That's when the X-Men moved to San Francisco in here, and then they moved to an island just right beside San Francisco, and then Avengers vs. X-Men happens. That kind of leads up to, you got Warren Ellis's Astonishing X-Men here. Sorry if I'm really going pretty fast through here. This is something that probably should take like 2 hours for me to talk about all this, and I don't have that much camera to do that. But Warren Ellis's Astonishing X-Men, a severe disappointment after you read Cassaday and Whedon's Astonishing X-Men. Even with the ending of Cassaday and Whedon's Astonishing X-Men being a disappointment, this is disappointing even in light of that. This makes you want to go back and reread the disappointing finale of Whedon and Cassaday's X-Men. But he did, I don't know, 2 or 3 volumes of Astonishing X-Men. It's hard to keep up because there was the ongoing Astonishing series, and then there was a couple of mini-series that were happening at the same time that were also written by him. But I stopped reading Astonishing after Ellis's run. So there are a few volumes of Astonishing that I have not yet read, but that was around the point where I stopped reading it. And then you've got Cable kind of jumping around in the future, trying to protect Hope Summers, and then another NYX series, which was not as good as the original series. And then I'm sorry if I'm going too fast here, guys. I'm definitely not going to be able to finish talking about all these X-Men books, but Carey's run on X-Men, it continues here with Professor Xavier being the main character. I've done a video on this X-Men and Spider-Man book. It's bad. The video's fine. This book is awful. And then we get several X-Men events kind of back-to-back. You've got Utopia, which is around the time when Norman Osborn was in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then you've got Necrotia, which is coming out of the events of Kyle and Yost's X-Force run. So again, if you want to read this big event, you're going to have to do like 3 or 4 years of homework reading all the stuff that they did in the X-Men world up until then. Nation X kind of bridges Utopia and Necrotia, and then after Necrotia you get Second Coming, which is a pretty big one with kind of a culmination of the Cable series where he was trying to protect Hope Summers, and then that's right around the time when I had a comic book shop that closed down, and I was trying to transition away from single issues, just full on go into trades forever. And so this is kind of where, I don't want to say that I lost track of the X-Men, but it was much harder for me to keep up with the X-Men. And to this day, there are entire runs of the X-Men that I have not read most of or any of because I was no longer buying single issues and keeping up with it week to week. I was just having to do, it was taking more effort to like, oh, there's a new X-Men trade that's coming out, I need to go ahead and buy that at some point. But then I've talked about X-Men forever. I did some videos on that earlier this year and late last year. So go, watch those videos. And then let's move Mr. Parker here. Then we got Mike Carey's run on Adjectiveless X-Men kind of concludes. Matt Wagner's run on Uncanny keeps going. Age of X, kind of a disappointing follow-up, if you will, on stories like the Age of Apocalypse. I feel like we do this all the time, where let's do another alternate reality where the X-Men are living in some horrible conditions. This one, it's not great. I don't think it is. So then we get Fear Itself was happening around this time, and then X-Men Schism, which leads into Cyclops keeping a more militant X-Men team on the island off of California, while Wolverine says we need to stop turning children into soldiers, so he takes a group and starts the school back up in New York. Wolverine and the X-Men by Jason Aaron, a really good series. I've done videos on that, but if you can't be bothered to watch those videos, I really liked Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men, and I even liked Jason Latour's follow-up series, which was also called Wolverine and the X-Men. I liked it, but it was a little disappointing, and it needed more room to breathe, and unfortunately did not get that room. So then, like I said, this is kind of where I was getting trades, but I wasn't keeping up with it as it was happening. Avengers vs. X-Men, to this day, I still think that series is just really bad. And then this is right around the point where the all-new Marvel Now, or maybe it was just Marvel Now, started. And so this is where Bendis' run on X-Men, Uncanny X-Men and All-New X-Men begins. And then there's some X books in there like Cable and X-Force and Uncanny X-Force, not the one by Rick Remender. It started, and I have read the first volume of both of these series. I have the rest of the run, I just haven't read the rest of either of those series. But Rick Remender's Uncanny X-Force, really solid. I completely forgot that. I think I did videos on those. I don't remember. If I haven't, just take my word for it. They're really good books. This Uncanny X-Force series, from what I read here, not nearly as good, but I will give you more of a full view on that whenever I read that run. But then we have Bendis' run, which I've already talked about in a video. We've got Amazing X-Men here, which unfortunately Jason Aaron only did the one volume, but that kind of ties in with his Wolverine and the X-Men. And then after that, I want to say it was Kyle and Yost who did some Amazing X-Men, and I've only read one of those volumes. And then there's another one, it's something about the Juggernaut, which I have not read because it's kind of hard to find. But then you got Cullen Bunn's Magneto series, which is criminally underrated. And then you got No More Humans, which was an original graphic novel. I'm really needing to hurry up here now, guys, because I'm getting down to the wire. And then Nightcrawler had his own solo series written by Chris Claremont. This was pretty okay. Claremont at this point really hit or miss, even like just a few years earlier in X-Men Forever. Some of it was really solid and some of it was not very good at all. Nightcrawler was not bad, considering Claremont really didn't care about the X-Men at large at this point. I listened to an interview with him at one point where he was saying basically he wasn't keeping up with the X-Men anymore, even though he was writing Nightcrawler. So that's a little odd. But then we've got, like I said, a lot of solo books here. Storm had her own solo book at this time, which I haven't read. Cyclops did. Magneto did. Nightcrawler did. And then Spider-Man and the X-Men, which was a follow-up to Latour's Wolverine and the X-Men. And that's a nice little miniseries. I really enjoy it. More of Bendis' stuff. This is around the time of Secret Wars, where you had Inferno, E is for Extinction, Extinction Agenda. I think I've done videos on all of those. And then I've got more X-Men books, but they're downstairs, and I'm probably not going to show them to you, but it's like a little bit of X-Men Blue, a little bit of X-Men Gold, X-Men Grand Design, which is definitely something you guys should check out. I don't remember I did a video on that, but it's really good. Another one of those, like, trying to make something workable out of the Silver Age stuff. But I've got just a little bit of X-Men stuff downstairs. My this whole thing, all 5 levels of this bookshelf is X-Men stuff, so I'm having to move down to another shelf right now, and I just don't have the camera power. I've got like 2 minutes left on this thing to go down and talk about that, but there's a little bit of stuff like Gambit and Rogue have their own ongoing series. Watch them now. I did a video on that. Really good series so far. I've only read the first volume, but that's about it on my X-Men collection, guys. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. For you who commented, I don't know if you want me mentioning your name, so I won't. I hope that this was something that was helpful for you. You'll probably have to just kind of freeze frame the video throughout to kind of see what I have here. But like I said, as far as the reading order goes, you can kind of just play it by ear, I think. But anyway, that's all that I have. So I hope you guys liked this video. In the meantime, I'll see you in the future with another one. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.